Hello, welcome again to Clinical Trial channel. This time, we would like to discuss on the very strategic publication issued by the US FDA, recently dated on 10th of November 2020, entitled Enhancing the Diversity of Clinical Trial Populations, Eligibility Criteria, Enrollment Practices, Trial Designs Guidance for the Industry. Please enjoy. This is the part 1, Enhancing the Diversity of Clinical Trial Populations, Eligibility Criteria, Enrollment Practices, Trial Designs Guidance for the Industry. The COVID-19 pandemic has reminded all that track health, research, and the impact of disease on minority and underserved or at-risk populations. Racial and ethnic minorities, such as African Americans and Hispanics, for example, are disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus, yet often don't participate in vaccine trials nearly as much as the white population. Now, to help turn this around, the US FDA, US Food and Drug Administration, just made available its final guidance with the regulatory authorities' recommendations for designing and executing clinical trials of drugs and biologics with an emphasis on diverse participation. Issued on November 9, 2020, entitled Enhancing the Diversity of Clinical Trial Populations, Eligibility Criteria, Enrollment Practices, and Trial Designs. This is the culmination of drafts with comments that are part of a bid to broaden eligibility criteria in clinical trials. By embracing inclusive trial design and practices, as well as methodological approaches, the FDA seeks to contribute to the ongoing modernization and advancement of drug, diagnostic, and device commercialization in the United States. The guidance aims to provide recommendations for how sponsors can increase enrollment of underrepresented population in their clinical trials. The FDA continues its mission to contribute to the goal of ensuring that clinical trials better reflect the population most likely to use the various drugs that are approved. A key goal involves the broadening of study eligibility criteria. Over the past few decades, FDA has promoted enrollment practices that would lead to clinical trials that better reflect the populations most likely to use the drug if the drug is approved, primarily through broadening eligibility criteria. Despite these efforts, challenges to participation in clinical trials remain, and certain groups continue to be underrepresented in many clinical trials. This guidance recommends approaches that sponsors of clinical trials intended to support a new drug application or a biologics license application can take to increase enrollment of underrepresented population in their clinical trials. This guidance also considers both demographic characteristics of study populations, like sex, race, ethnicity, age, location of residency, and non-demographic characteristics of populations, like patients with organ dysfunction, comorbid conditions, disabilities, those at the extremes of the weight range, and population with diseases or conditions with low prevalence. Enrolling participants with a wide range of baseline characteristics may create a study population that more accurately reflects the patients likely to take the drug if it is approved, and allow assessment of the impact of those characteristics on the safety and effectiveness of the study drug. Consistent with the FDARA mandate, this guidance will discuss broadening eligibility criteria and avoiding unnecessary exclusions for clinical trials. And the second, developing eligibility criteria and improving trial recruitment so that the participants enrolled in trials will better reflect the population most likely to use the drug if the drug is approved, while maintaining safety and effectiveness standards. And the third, applying the recommendation for broadening eligibility criteria to clinical trials of drug intended to treat rare diseases or conditions. Broadening eligibility criteria to increase diversity in enrollment. One objective of eligibility criteria is to exclude people from participating in a trial for whom the risk of an adverse event outweighs both that individual's potential benefit from participating and the importance of the knowledge that may be expected to result. The FDA recognizes that certain exclusions are appropriate when necessary to help protect such individuals. Medically complex patients with certain concomitant illness or those taking particular drugs may also be excluded in drug development programs. Such patients may be more susceptible to a potential toxicity of the investigational drug and can experience adverse events that are related to their underlying conditions or concomitant treatments. It as a participant's current medications interact with the investigational drug, which may impact their ability to complete the trial or meet all of the trial obligations. As data on excretory and metabolic pathways and drug-drug interactions become available during the drug development program, allowing appropriate dose adjustment, there should be fewer exclusions related to concomitant medications or comorbidities. Similarly, as the safety experience with a product increases, eligibility criteria should be broadened to include more medically complex participants. Any remaining exclusions should be justified. The FDA also recognizes that some eligibility criteria have become commonly accepted over time or used as a template across trials, sometimes excluding certain population from trials without strong clinical or scientific justification. For example, older adults, those at the extremes of the weight range, those with malignancies, or certain infections such as HIV, and children. Some patients may be unable to participate without reasonable accommodation, such as patients with physical and/or mental disabilities, non-English speakers, patients who work and require evening or weekend hours, and some older adult patients with limited access to transportation. Unnecessary exclusion of such participants may lead to a failure to discover important safety information about use of the investigational drug in patients who will take the drug after approval. Therefore, broadening eligibility criteria in later stages of drug development for the phase 3 population increases the ability to understand that therapy's benefit-risk profile across the patient population likely to use the drug in clinical practice. Inclusive trial practices. There are many approaches a sponsor should take to broaden eligibility criteria in clinical trials to ensure that the study population better reflects the patient population likely to use the drug in clinical practice. The FDA provides the following recommendation and encourages sponsors to consider other FDA recommendations as appropriate. When developing clinical trial protocols, work to ensure that eligibility criteria serve the goal of having a representative sample of the population for whom the drugs has been developed and examine each exclusion criterion to determine if it is needed to help assure the safety of trial participants or to achieve the study objective. If it is not needed, consider eliminating or modifying the criterion to expand the study population. For example, when exclusions are necessary because participants with impaired organ function would be placed at unreasonable risk, base the exclusion on an appropriately specific measure of organ dysfunction that does not lead to the unnecessary exclusion of participants with milder dysfunction. If there are unreasonable risks to participants with advanced heart failure, but enrollments of those with milder disease would be appropriate, the exclusion criteria should specifically define the population of heart failure participants that should be excluded. Sponsors should enroll participants who reflect the characteristics of clinically relevant population with regard to age, sex, race, and ethnicity. Inadequate participation and/or data analysis from clinically relevant populations can lead to insufficient information pertaining to medical product safety and effectiveness for product labeling. This objective can be met through, first, inclusion of children and adolescents in confirmatory clinical trials involving adults when appropriate. And the second, inclusion of women in clinical trials in adequate numbers to allow for analysis by sex, for example, by avoiding unjustified exclusion based on sex and taking other actions to promote inclusion. For most drugs, representatives of both sexes should be included in clinical trials in numbers adequate to allow detection of clinically significant sex-related differences in drug response. And the third, inclusion of racial and ethnic minorities in clinical trials, and the analysis of clinical trial data by race and ethnicity. Differences in response to medical products example, pharmacokinetics, efficacy, or safety, have been observed in racially and ethnically distinct subgroups of the US population. These differences may be attributable to intrinsic factors, for example, genetics, metabolism, elimination, and extrinsic factors like diet, environmental exposure, sociocultural issues, or interactions between these factors. Analyzing data on race and ethnicity may assist in identifying population-specific signals. This is end of part 1 and to be continued to part 2. Thank you for your kind attention. God bless.